Well, good afternoon and welcome. I'm Vincent Rougeau, the Dean of Boston College Law School, and on behalf of all of us here at Boston College Law School, it's my pleasure to welcome you to today's webinar, Racial Justice and Democracy, How an Improved Democracy is a Conduit for Racial Justice, and how an improved democracy can make way for more racially just policies. In a moment, our moderator, Jordan Wilson, will introduce our panelists. Jordan is a BC Law student, the treasurer of BC's Black Law Student Association, and a co-founder of Politicking. But before we begin, I thought I'd take a moment to share a personal story to frame today's discussion. When she was growing up in the 1940s and 1950s, my mother's hometown in Louisiana was considered a relatively progressive place for its time. Black people were actually able to vote there. And it's funny to consider what this means about our history, that we can actually be impressed by that fact. There was one catch, however. You were only supposed to vote for the incumbent, in those days, the Democrat. So one year, my grandfather decided that he was going to vote for the other guy. So he put a sign up in his front yard signaling his intention. Well, that very same day, my mother and all of her siblings were thrown off the school bus, and the family lost all access to public services until my grandfather took his sign down. Now, it must be said that these were relatively benign punishments, but the fact remains that they were punished for daring to decide and to publicize how they wished to exercise their right to vote. Unfortunately, given what is happening around the country in the wake of the 2020 election and in the years prior as well, we can't dismiss my story as something from a dark and ugly past. States around the country are working overtime to make voting difficult or impossible in many ways that are designed to suppress voting among people of color, poor and working class people, and young people, just to name a few groups. Voter suppression and intimidation remain mortal threats to our democracy. So to hear more about how we can respond, I turn to our wonderful experts here today, whom I'm very pleased to welcome to BC Law, and to today's moderator, Jordan Wilson, who will introduce them. Jordan.
Thanks so much, Dean Rougeau. We celebrate you and all you do to give us a space for these conversations. And as you said, the time to have a discussion around race and democracy is now more than ever. And so I want to move into introducing our wonderful panelists. They come from a diverse set of backgrounds, and they all have a diverse set of work and obligations to pushing forward through race and democracy. I want to start with Rahsaan Hall, who's the director of the Racial Justice Program for the American Civil Liberties Union of Massachusetts. In this role, Rahsaan helps develop the ACLU of Massachusetts' integrated advocacy approach to address racial justice issues through legislative advocacy, litigation, and community engagement. The program works on issues that deeply impact communities of color and historically disenfranchised communities. Dean Melissa Nobles is the Keenan Sahin Dean of the School of Humanities, Arts, and Social Sciences and Professor of Political Science at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. Dean Nobles' research and teachings have focused on the comparative study of racial and ethnic politics and issues of retrospective justice. Dean Nobles is a graduate of Brown University, where she majored in history. She received her, and I heard that her and Dean Rougeau were classmates, but she received her MA and PhD in political science from Yale University. Dean Nobles has held fellowships at Boston University's Institute for Race and Social Division and Harvard University's Radcliffe Center for Advanced Study. She has served on the editorial boards of Polity, American Political Science Review, and Perspectives on Politics journals. And last but not least, we are joined by our Secretary of State, William Galvin, who served as the Secretary of the Commonwealth since first being elected in 1994. Secretary Galvin is a graduate of Boston College and of Suffolk Law, a former state representative for Allston-Brighton. As Secretary, he is the principal public information officer for the state and oversees our elections and election laws, which are very important. I want to remind everyone before I ask our wonderful panelists to take 4 to 5 minutes to do their own remarks. I want to actually remind everyone joining us to raise your voice. Be sure to add any questions to the chat box, and our wonderful organizers will be sure to gather them and to give you an opportunity to ask them towards the end of the formal discussion. And so without further ado, I would love to start with you, Attorney Hall, to take 4 to 5 minutes to let us know what's on your mind today and what sort of work you are currently engaged in around the issue.
Well, first of all, thank you so much, Jordan, for the invitation and for the group that you all are working with to host this event in the Cloud Center. And thank you, Dean Rougeau, for those very moving opening remarks to help center us in the reality of this nation's history. And so at the ACLU, the work that we are engaged in as it relates to our democracy is broad and vast. Most recently, we've been actively engaged in ensuring the turnout for census, because the census is critically important. And now that that information has been collected, we're working in a larger coalition called the Drawing Democracy Coalition to focus on redistricting. 10 years ago, we had a very open and transparent process. I think not in small part because the prior two processes resulted in litigation, and one of those ended up in somebody, the then Speaker of the House, being indicted and sentenced to prison. And so I think the group of legislators that were heading up that commission last time around wanted to make sure that the process was as inclusive and as transparent as possible. And it yielded magnificent results. It increased majority minority districts in the state representative and the state House of Representatives from 10 to 20, state Senate districts from 2 to 3, and created the first majority minority congressional district, which is held by Congresswoman Ayanna Pressley. And so we are part of that same coalition of organizations this time around to ensure that we have a robust process that includes as many voices as possible and increases the access to democracy for the groups who have historically been marginalized or underrepresented in the halls of government. The other piece of work that we're engaged in is pushing for the Votes Act, which would make permanent the temporary protections that were put in place last year for COVID to ensure mail-in voting, to make sure that there are drop boxes available for people to fix the automatic voter registration system that we have in place, to mandate that we are a part of the Electronic Registration Information Center, or ERIC, and increase voting access and opportunities for folks who are currently incarcerated. But the big piece of that is same-day registration, which has been shown to have an increase in voter turnout. And so when you think about the context of what is happening in the country, even though Massachusetts is deemed or viewed as a progressive or liberal bastion, there are still opportunities to improve and do much better the work and act of democracy. And one of the ways that we do that is increasing access to the ballot and to the system, making sure that there is good representation and that everyone who is eligible to vote is able to be registered and vote, and particularly those in the most disenfranchised, underrepresented, and marginalized communities. So we're doing that work in coalition, but it's also part of the larger national work that the ACLU is engaged in. And I'll stop there, and we can talk more about this critical juncture that we're at in our country later.
Thanks so much, Attorney Hall. Dean Nobles, please.
Great. Thank you so much. And thank you again for this invitation. I look forward to our discussion. So I approached this as a political scientist, and I apologize for coming in late, so I missed the Dean's opening remarks. But I'll say this, I come to this as a political scientist who studies comparative politics. And my early part of my career, I studied Brazilian politics. And a big part of that has been looking at around the globe, the issue of democratization and the role of the ending of authoritarian regimes and the beginnings of democratic ones around the country. In Latin America, much of the latter part of the 20th century was caught in military regimes, also in Africa, and then of course the decline of the Soviet Union. I raise all of that to say, at the beginning, when we talked about authoritarianism and democratization, the United States was always the exception. That is, even with the history of even with our own history, which I would argue, at least for the period of Jim Crow segregation in the American South, would constitute sub-authoritarianism within the US. And that's a term that is now increasingly used by scholars of American politics to describe the period from about the end of Reconstruction to the passage of the Voting Rights Act in 1965 as a descriptor, not a ideological claim, but merely when you have an important segment of the population disenfranchised and not able to participate in that, you are effectively living in an authoritarian state in as much as Black citizens were concerned. And so I thought, okay, that now was coming into an important way of thinking about our country's history. And I thought that's an important truth that needs to be acknowledged. You can write around it all you want, but if you read the actual history and study it, then the appropriateness of that descriptor becomes clear. And so I raise that to say two things. One, as we're seeing in the world with what's going on now in our country in particular, the rising concerns about what appears to be anti-democratic forces in ways that people used to think unimaginable, but looks increasingly like the ways in which democracy around the world is under assault. And at the same time, encouraging Americans to think more closely at our own history, that it's not simply abroad that is happening, but we can look at our own past history to get a sense of history of democracy's progression over time, which has come through activism. I mean, it's been the basis of social movement. So in other words, it gives us another way of thinking about the civil rights movement as a democratization movement, and not merely or only, as important as civil rights were, a civil rights movement. But it was about instantiating a basic political right of what we think democracy is, which is the right to vote. And it's not merely voting, but it's also what voting entails. It holds politicians accountable. And it also means that they have to take you into account. If you are a member of a disenfranchised group and they don't think that their future depends upon your voting, then you effectively have no voice. So it's important. I mean, you can't imagine being a full participating member of a political community without the right to vote. And I'll say, one final thing about this. In other countries, Brazil, Australia, there's the compulsory vote, right? That you actually just have to be, there's a penalty, at least in Brazil and other places, to vote. But, compelling people to vote does not also just mean democracy, right? I mean, Brazil has that and also had military dictatorship. So in other words, there has to be a societal and a democratic culture, not merely the institutions are important, of course, but there is also a commitment that everyone knows that the only game in town is democracy. And for much of our country's history, it seems that we understood that was the game. And I think the 21st century is making us wonder, is that so? So I imagine we'll begin to talk a bit more about this. So I just want to say, I'm not trying to be alarmist here, of course, but I am trying to bring the perspective of someone who thinks comparatively about these issues and wants the U.S. to give us the opportunity to be a part of the world as we think about the organization of our political life.
Wow. Attorney Hall and Dean Nobles, you all could drop the mic right now. I thank you for starting this discussion with such thought-provoking comments. And so, Secretary Galvin, if you don't mind just giving us 4 to 5 minutes of background on what you're thinking now and what you're engaged in, we'll get the formal discussion started.
Thank you, and thank you for allowing me to participate in your forum. I think it's a very significant time, I mentioned that already. For clearly, we now know this year, and this began so inauspiciously for democracy, how fragile democracy is in this country, which I don't think any of us really completely, at least I certainly didn't completely appreciate that until it was so clearly demonstrated to us recently. We come off an election which was remarkable because of a high level of participation generally, and I think even more remarkable because it proved that voters of color in particular could be very decisive in the process. And I think the proof of that has been the immediate reaction that Mr. Hall referred to already in the efforts around the country to change the law. And I think that is an immediate crisis. That is something that has to be addressed right away. And as it continues in various states throughout the country, I think it argues for a national response. There is a reason the 15th Amendment was passed to make sure that the right to vote was protected from the states. It empowers Congress to do something about it. And I think it's very important that Congress do something about it. Now, as we know, the House recently passed legislation, the House of Representatives in Washington, passed legislation that would have touched on many of these topics. The question is, what can pass the Senate, what can get through to the president, and to make sure the president signs it, which I assume he would. I think it's critically important that we prioritize the importance of allowing people to vote outside of the usual processes. So in other words, voting by mail in particular and extending voting opportunities. I think that's of all of the issues that are raised in the legislation that passed the Congress, I think the one that's been proven to be the most effective in affecting the outcome that actually has expanded democracy the most has been voting by mail and early voting. Those are the key features, I believe, that have to be protected. And I think that's where Congress needs to speak. Certainly, the precedent is there. You know, when I first assumed this office, one of the first challenges I had was to implement the so-called motor voter law, which in its time was a remarkable piece of legislation. What it did was it said that every state had to afford people the opportunity to register to vote in the context of registering a motor vehicle or getting a driver's license. And the reason it was significant was it mandated in every state, but it also said that if you didn't do this, you wouldn't get any federal highway money. A very effective way of incentivizing making sure the states did what they had to do. I think that same type of approach is needed right now. The states are very dependent upon the monies, certainly this most recent national election, but in all elections are dependent upon the monies they receive from the national government, the Election Assistance Commission and others. The idea that you give states money, yet at the same time tolerate their willingness to curtail the rights of their citizens to vote, and I might say a very pointed effort. I mean, it is not just a general idea that, oh, it's too much work, it's too cumbersome. No, this is clearly targeted at voters of color. And it's not just because of the outcome in Georgia that we saw in the runoff. It's very clearly targeted. There's no question. The idea that we would tolerate that and still give some of these states money is ridiculous. And it needs to be called out right now. I think the other piece that I'm happy to speak to, because I want to get to the questions, I'm sure my other panelists do as well, is the importance of election administration. Election laws are, of course, the key. You start with that. But election administration is also very important. And I think we had a clear example of that in Georgia, where you had Republican administrators who were obviously threatened, yet did the right thing. And they went along. I got a call earlier in the year from the Republican Secretary of State of Nevada, who told me how she was being intimidated about voting by mail in Nevada and how she was upset about it and because she knew what we were doing here and what we were doing here. So I think that kind of honest administration is critically important as well. Those are the two keys, I think, to bring about our greater participation in democracy. And as was noted by the other panelists, democracy is really the key. The voting is the key to democracy. It's not simply about democracy as a phrase. It works only when people vote, and that's how democracy is advanced, by voting. And I think we've had a clear example of that within recent months, and we need to take sight of that and make sure we act on what we now know. So I'll be happy to answer any questions anyone might have.
You said a word that was so key, Secretary Galvin, and that is action. And so our first question asks that there seems to be a longstanding argument threaded throughout, I would argue, our nation's history that we only want certain people to vote. This, of course, includes the original enfranchisement restrictions of our founding. Today, we often see arguments against expanding opportunities to vote, as you just mentioned, Secretary. We do not want uninformed people to vote if someone isn't informed enough to know how to register properly they are not informed enough to vote, or at least that's what some folks argue. So how do you all feel about these claims? And I'd like to stick with the original order, which starts with you, Attorney Hall.
Yeah, I mean that framing is highly problematic. It's racist, right? If we're going to talk about who is informed enough to register to vote, are being the only people who are deserving of the vote, it completely turns a blind eye to the history of racism and oppression in this country, and it would further incentivize keeping certain segments of the population undereducated and under-resourced, so that they could not have access to figure out how to register to vote or get access to the polls. And so I think removing as many barriers as possible to engaging in our democracy is what's going to make us a better society. And then there's a question around what is who is the arbiter of intelligence or qualifications? Constitutional provisions, certainly here in the state of Massachusetts, don't require background checks or educational attainment levels in order to be registered to vote. You just have to be 18, a resident of Massachusetts, and not have been convicted of a voting fraud crime or a crime related to voting right. That's it. The Secretary knows this. We even battled over whether or not the state registration deadline is a requirement and whether or not it's constitutional under the Massachusetts Constitution. The Supreme Judicial Court felt that it was, but it also gave language as to why, practically speaking, the practical reasons for why there needs to be a registration deadline so that it can be administered effectively. But the substantive issue of whether or not someone is entitled to vote or qualified to vote is highly problematic, and we should shun any notion or concept of that when we think about who are the people who are most likely to be disenfranchised by that type of mindset. It's going to be overwhelmingly people of color, particularly Black and Native folks. It's going to be overwhelmingly immigrant populations and overwhelmingly people who are poor. I think, again, this concept of democracy and engaging the populace of the country includes all of those whose ideas we don't necessarily agree with and who have not had the benefit or privilege of education. So,
absolutely, please, Dean Nobles.
Sure, thank you. So I'll just add a bit on to what Attorney Hall said there. I think it's largely a rhetorical strategy to, and kind of political one to try to make a political case for limiting those who are eligible, but not really a case that's defensible. If you live in whatever the boundaries of a political community, all members should have the, as a philosophical matter, should have an ability to influence and have some stake in it. Responsibilities of citizenship and also the benefits of political membership, and to be held accountable by those with whom their public trust is invested. So I think this, as a philosophical matter, it is indefensible, and at least some part of what democracy requires means taking all into account and having their preferences in some way registered. And the most open way of getting to the franchise seems to me the one that most aligns with that commitment. And so I think you have to have some idea of what a democracy is, and then have the mechanisms align accordingly.
Secretary Galvin, I'd love to hear from you on this question.
Well, I have a lot of experience with the question. Let me say this, a couple of things that have come to my mind. I know we're focused at the moment on the racial aspect of it, but my experiences run in a couple of different directions from race. One of the challenges I had to confront early on was we had a number of people who objected, both local officials and in some cases actually relatives of voters who were mentally challenged. People who certainly were capable, were able to work, but had aptitude issues that in some ways might be described as challenging for them, living in group homes or group residences. And the question was, should they be allowed to register to vote? Well, the answer that my office gave is, of course they should. If they're aware, if they know exactly, the concept, what it means, they're clearly citizens, they have the age, why would they not be registered? Well, the same issue of competence was raised. Well, who are they to judge? I mean, the competence was there. They clearly could, they had the ability to know who they were. They had the ability to write their name. They knew what they were doing. Why would we say that they would not have the right to do that? And we ruled that way. And that was something that I think we did obviously the right thing, but also we confronted this issue head on. As I remember saying at the time, as an older person declines maybe in capacity, would we say, well, wait a minute, they don't know anymore what they're doing. We should not allow, how do you judge that either? The other aspect of it that I point out is the issue of language. Very often, not just under the Federal Voting Rights Act, but also in our own practices here in Massachusetts, we've reached out to print ballots and applications and other materials in different languages. People who don't fluently speak English, but clearly are citizens. That's not the issue. The issue is their ability to maneuver English. And we print ballots in multiple languages. We print materials that we were not required to print under the Voting Rights Act in multiple languages, in languages that were not covered by the Voting Rights Act necessarily, precisely for these reasons. They are citizens, they have the right to register, they have the right to vote, and you want to make that an opportunity that's meaningful. So I think the idea that somehow by limiting the franchise, limiting access to the franchise, you're employing some sort of genuine standard of qualification is ridiculous. And it's something foreign to us, and we shouldn't do it.
Before I start this second question, I want to remind our panelists or our audience to share questions with our panelists. You're open to put them into the chat box or the Q&A so that we could make sure that we utilize this time to really get our panelists' thoughts. And the second question I have for all of you is that there's some underlying tension with the idea of a capitalist democracy. On one hand, we have a market system that demands inequality. On the other hand, concepts of political equality underlie modern conceptions of democracy. Factoring in our country's history of racial capitalism and the exploitation, how can we make sense of this tension?
Are we going in the same order, or are you just offering that up to anybody?
That's right. No, this is a permanent order.
Oh, okay.
Yep,
okay.
yep.
It's an interesting tension, and one that is kind of at the core of this nation's identity, the racial capitalism that kind of evolves from slavery and is the cornerstone of this nation's wealth and foundation, and the subsequent kind of criminalization, particularly of Black communities and a way of disenfranchising them, has consistently put the rights of those who are oppressed with intention with the kind of the functioning of democracy. And who has access to power, who has access to capital and wealth, is something that plays out, I think, particularly when we look at power brokers and how they are influencing electoral campaigns, advancing particular legislative or policy initiatives through what are perceived as democratic means, right? We've supported a candidate. That candidate has advocated for our position and has advanced our agenda, while at the same time it is furthering the systems of structural racism. It's cementing the systems of oppression, right? We think about some of the current issues that people have taken to the street to address: police violence, disparity in COVID vaccination rates and disparities in COVID deaths, the educational gaps that exist, which are exacerbated by economic inequality, and the technological gap. We think about gentrification that is happening, and a lot of these things that are existing are maintained by laws that are enacted by lawmakers who have been supported by particular by individuals. When we think about it through the lens of capitalism, by individuals that are trying to advance that framework. And now that we're seeing a growing grassroots movement, leftist movements, kind of populist movements in the sense that it is speaking to the needs of the masses of the people who are oppressed. I think it's starting to tug at the strings of kind of the racial capitalism that exists. Black folks are taking to the streets to say Black Lives Matters, and it's not just about the killing of George Floyd, but it's the compounding of all of these issues, that uninterrupted thread that runs from this nation's history and slavery through Reconstruction and through Jim Crow, through the war on poverty, the war on crime, the war on drugs, to mass incarceration. And at the center of it is these capitalist ideologies. And if we look at capitalism as controlling the means of production, thinking about democracy, who is being controlled in that? So I feel like we are at a very unique moment where BIPOC communities are advocating, pushing back, and calling out white supremacy and structures of oppression, and at the same time engaging in conversations around alternative economic systems and ideas. And I think it's really challenging the small d democratic institutions to really think about the reliance on capital when it's on capitalism, when it's cast in the lens of racial capitalism, because it has continued to exploit people of color, particularly Black people and Native folks. And I think that's all the more reason to reduce the barriers to political engagement. Someone dropped a question in the chat about enfranchising those who are incarcerated. I think that's important. Massachusetts was one of the few states that allowed full enfranchisement up until 1997, when that right was taken away. When we think about kind of the racist roots of felony disenfranchisement, we can't think of over incarceration in southern states where there is a prevalence of those felony disenfranchisement laws without thinking about convict leasing, which grows out of the reaction to Reconstruction, the end of slavery, because Black people were no longer controlled, no longer able to be the source of the economic engine of this country. But you see the rise of the Black codes that criminalize Black conduct and Black behavior, and then these former plantations are then leased. People are leased out to them through the criminalization of people. So that tension that exists is being challenged, and it's being unraveled. And the more engagement there is, I think the better off as a society we are, because it expands not only access to the franchise and to political ideals and to legislation that addresses the needs of disenfranchised people, but it also shifts the economic centering of this country.
Absolutely. Dean Numbers, we love your feedback.
Sure. So I think about it that there is a real tension, and I think I want to call attention to the ways in which democracy tries to work can potentially work against certain of the excesses of the role of money in politics. So we all are concerned about that, in as much as it suggests a certain kind of minoritarian dimension to politics, that is, the rich can, through PACs and other ways, influence the decisions that are made by politicians, and what checks can there be on that. And one of the things is the vote, right? That is voting out those members, or not voting them in, those who seem to be overly beholden to interests that are not that of the general population. So arguably, a lot of scholars have written about this, about the strategy that particularly the Republican Party has taken to combine what is essentially a white racist populist view with a quite plutocratic prone agenda. right? And the tax cuts being one in 2017, the most unpopular. If you look at the past, I think 10 or 20 years of legislation, it was one of the most unpopular pieces of legislation by the American people. So one would say, well, how is it that it was voted in? So some political scientists said we seem to have a merger of kind of a plutocratic agenda with the populist face. And a lot of the work, a really interesting book written by two political scientists, one from Yale, one from University of Berkeley, California, Let Them Eat Tweets, really talks about this, if you will, kind of unholy alliance between these two interests within the Republican Party. So what is the answer? The answer is, it seems what we've been seeing, which is a Democratic Party, which at least a party and a segment of the American population who actually wants to use the vote to build a Democratic Party with a different agenda that is much more center-based, getting at that tension, which is, using the levers of democracy to begin to reshape the relationship between capital and power. I don't want to be naive. Obviously this runs quite deep, as the Attorney Hall said. So obviously, it's not going to change overnight, but one can imagine society where we didn't have democratic levers, when we couldn't vote out politicians who seem to be going against what many of us would consider a more popular interest, not populism, but just for the majority of Americans. That ends up being where a pretty important role of democracy through the vote becomes even more important. I'll just finally say this. A lot of these everyone puts in a lot of money. These big donors put in a lot of money, and they have to wonder when their candidates lose. They spent a lot of money. The money arguably wasn't well spent in certain ways. So in other words, the democracy can help curb certain of the excesses. It's more than a franchise, but it most certainly is the franchise. And I think the most recent elections show that.
I have to agree. Please, Secretary Galvin.
I think once again, our timing today couldn't be better. We just saw the passage of the stimulus anti-COVID bill. We all witnessed the marathon debate in the Senate over the last several days. And what are the issues that we're speaking about that were debated there? It was this amount of aid to the most needy, and surely that is a democracy issue. It was the minimum wage. Surely that is a democracy issue. And it was also, at what point does corporate giveaway end, or corporate support sustenance end? And I think that speaks to what Dean Noble spoke to, the contrast between the first major piece of legislation passing in the previous administration being a massive tax cut that was focused primarily corporately, and in which there was very little, if any, popular support. It was a debate and a discussion that was completely insulated from the popular issue. And now we have a bill that, where all of the issues that were controversial were issues that related to exactly how targeted this was going to be to help the most needy. And that, I think, reflects the power of democracy. That tension in discussing how we're going to administer a capital system that's obviously been affected by the pandemic, how are we going to respond to that, was affected by the results of the election. Were it not for the two election results in Georgia, this would not have happened. It could not have happened. So I think if we were looking for an example, once again, bringing us back to the significance of democracy and specifically voting in how we decide how our capital system is administered, we just had it, and contrast that to what occurred 4 years ago. So I think all of that, once again, brings us back to the same place. How do we make sure that we continue to protect that source of protection and authority for democracy? And it's about voting. That's what it's about.
Absolutely. So what policy changes are top of mind for you all to actually advance racial justice, equity, and democracy in Massachusetts? And for example, many people attribute our democratic dysfunctions to a broken campaign finance system, which perpetuates racial injustices throughout the maintenance of private prison systems, environmental racism, and other areas of concern. So whether it's campaign finance reform or other related issues, what specific policies would Massachusetts consider to improve democracy and racial justice? And as actors within our democratic systems in the state, what will you do for them?
So, as I said earlier, removing as many barriers as possible to participation in our political system is what's going to be key. And it's been shown that same-day registration is one of the more significant factors that increases participation. And it's been shown that overwhelmingly, a majority of the people who use same-day registration are people who are renewing or updating their registration. So it's not like it's a bunch of unregistered voters just showing up. But it does eliminate that barrier to people who want to participate in the electoral process and for any number of reasons would have missed the registration deadline, whether it's because their lives are complicated and they just hadn't had a chance to get around to it, or they weren't politically engaged until something happened nationally that captured their attention. And they said, you know what, I can't tolerate this. I need to get involved. And because of some arbitrary deadline now, they're not able to be engaged or involved. And so allowing same-day registration, which has been proven to work in many other states, is key. I think mail-in voting has been shown to be a success. I appreciate the secretary signaling that he feels that mail-in voting should be made permanent here in Massachusetts, and that's our hope that we see that in legislation. Particularly, I think the pandemic really drew out the deep racial inequities and societal inequities that exist, and the fact that people from some of the most marginalized communities would have to make a trade-off between their health and safety and participating in an election was deeply disturbing. And so I'm glad that last year we were able to enact protections that would allow people to cast a vote by mail while retaining in-person voting, which is key. I think there are improvements that need to be made for people who are disabled so that they can access those same benefits of mail-in voting and still have in-person voting. I think early voting is also key, early person, both mail-in and in person. We want to create as many opportunities for people to register and be able to vote and have their vote counted, to have their information regularly updated. We already have automatic voter registration where there are certain entities where through your involvement, whether it's the Registry of Motor Vehicles or public assistance offices, you are automatically registered. We want to tweak that because right now it's at the beginning of the transaction. It gives people an opportunity to opt out. What is the kind of the gold standard is after transaction. So after you've completed your transaction, you've been informed that you'll be automatically registered, then you can opt out. And that's shown to have an important increase in participation. We need to make sure that we are enrolled in the ERIC system, which is going to address some of the concerns that the naysayers who talk about voter fraud and when it comes to mail-in voting or same-day registration. This addresses that because it makes sure that our voter rolls are accurate and up to date, and that we have consistent quality information in there. And so these are some of the things. These are the things that are included in the Votes Act. We want to make sure that people who are incarcerated in Massachusetts, we don't have felony disenfranchisement for people after they've been released, but we do have it for folks who are serving a sentence. But for the people who are held pretrial, meaning they're held on bail, or the people who are held on some sort of administrative detention or serving a sentence on a misdemeanor, they're still eligible to vote. We need to make sure that they have access to that information, but ultimately we want to re-enfranchise those people who are serving sentences as well. What better way to help people take seriously the obligation to be a contributing member of society than to engage in the electoral process early on? And I think so those are some of the key things that are at stake right now before the legislature, and we're hoping that they will pass. But those are some of the things that I think will help increase access and address some of the concerns. And I guess finally, it goes without saying that redistricting is going to be key, increasing access and opportunity in communities of color so that they can elect a candidate of their choice. So with some of the demographic shifts that have occurred in the Commonwealth, there is an opportunity to create some more majority minority districts so that people that live in districts that have significant concentrations of one ethnic or one racial group or a coalition of people of color can coalesce and elect a candidate of their choice that is going to advance some of the very policies that are going to address other social justice and systemic issues.
We're excited to follow some of the efforts that you've mentioned, Attorney Hall, you're really pushing for over the course of the next couple of months. And so, Dean Nobles, please.
Well, my response is a bit more indirect. Being involved in an academic institution, our view is a little bit more on thinking about it as a helping our students understand the importance of voting, but also within our scholarship. So we have it in this is to certain of Secretary Galvin's early remarks about the importance of election administration. So we've set up within the political science department at MIT, there is a election administrations lab. It's headed up by Charles Stewart, who is involved a lot with a lot of the issues around elections administrations for this past election, that is getting a sense of surveying and accounting for what's happening in each of the states, and was part of the efforts to provide the evidence that everything was going well, and in fact that state administrators were taking their jobs very seriously, and were not kind of these partisan hotbeds as had been at least part of certain of the political rhetoric. So we see our job as kind of participating in helping to create an informed electorate, an informed citizenry, and scholars who are working along with practitioners to better document and help along the administration of our elections and study them, get a better sense of what's happening and how people are voting and such. So we do a lot of survey data, and all of that is intended to make for a more informed electorate. Facts have a good way of beating out a lot of the rhetoric and such. And we think our job at MIT is to be engaged in the world by bringing facts to bear.
Secretary Galvin, if you don't mind closing out this question.
Not at all. I'm happy to. In Massachusetts, because you focused the question about Massachusetts, we're coming off a very successful election experience in 2020 by any standard. Because of the pandemic, we introduced a number of provisions that were first time. And certainly no excuse absentee voting was at the top of the list because it engaged so many people. And I'm very proud of the result we had. Not only did we have a record participation in all 3 state elections that we ran last year, the presidential primary, the state primary, and the general election, we also had no issues regarding the accuracy and the honesty of the count. No issues whatsoever. And we had a prompt response in terms of the count was available very early and very reliably. So I'm very proud of that, and it gives us much to build on. I authored the bill that authorized that last year. I have filed legislation this year to extend all of that and many of the other issues that have been discussed as far as Massachusetts is concerned, including same day that Mr. Hall has mentioned a couple of times. I think that getting that legislation through is, I think we will do. I think we have broad support for it. And I think that's something, once again, that we can say to the country, because as important it is for us to do it, we're, even here in New England, we're looking at states like New Hampshire that are looking at reducing their availability to vote. And that's something we should by moving our legislation through promptly, we are in a better position to be part of the national discussion of how important this is as a national issue. And as I've already mentioned, should be addressed federally. The other issue I think that has been mentioned a couple of times is the political redistricting process that will take place. The key though there, which we've not talked about, is the accuracy of the 2020 census. And I, as the census liaison for Massachusetts, have been particularly concerned and alarmed about the census as it was taken nationally and certainly here in Massachusetts. We spent a lot of time, effort, and money here in Massachusetts to try to address the issues. We were constantly up against the effort to politicize the census by the Trump administration, most notably cutting short the actual door-to-door count, which absolutely disadvantaged communities of color. The communities we were working on and focused on that had low response rate at the time the census was abruptly ended were cities like Chelsea and Lawrence and New Bedford and others. And we are now working on a process to try to make sure that the figures which have been delayed because of the flaws in that census count accurately reflect our population. I have sent various state materials, records from private sector entities such as colleges and universities and others to the Census Bureau and have urged them to incorporate this in their final count if they're missing census tract material. Just the other day, I had a conversation, a conference call with the Census Bureau. I think this is critically important. It's not possible to draw representative districts if you don't have the underlying numbers. We have to make sure the numbers are accurate and that they fairly reflect the population in many of our older cities, which oftentimes are home to communities of color. That's a real big challenge for all across the country right now, but particularly for states like ours. So that's something I'm working on, and something I know there's been litigation already commenced by a couple of states, and something if we have to litigate, we should. And I would hope that entities such as the ACLU and others will participate in that litigation if it becomes necessary. I'm hoping it's not. I'm hoping that the new administration and the new Secretary of Commerce, was just sworn in this week, will address this issue. But I am concerned that the Trump administration is over, and the people who fomented the political effort on this are gone. But the bureaucracy doesn't always respond that rapidly either. And I think now the challenge is not so much to address the political issues that were raised by the Trump people as it is to make sure the bureaucracy does its best to accurately count communities if in fact they fail to do it so in the actual counting process, which I believe they did. So that's an immediate challenge that Massachusetts and other states are facing.
You know, it's such a shame our formal questions are limited to only 3. We're airtight on the remainder of our time. So I'm going to actually ask questions on an individual basis. And what I'll do is ask you the first question, Secretary Galvin, and you the very last, Dean Nobles. Attorney Hall, you actually spoke very eloquently on our first audience question. And so Secretary Galvin, as mentioned by Attorney Hall, America has, in disproportionately incarcerating Black people, actually stripped many of us of our rights to vote. So can you talk about allowing persons who are incarcerated to vote? How effective are the current procedures to allow those in prison and jails to vote? If you want to answer that question with the focus on Massachusetts, that'd be great.
Well, that's fine. Let's start with what the law is. The law, as Mr. Hall mentioned, is that in Massachusetts, incarcerated felons may not vote. That law was passed by the voters. That wasn't something the legislature did, it was passed by the voters. So in order to change that, the voters would have to vote on it as well, again. There is, however, as was noted, that there are a category of prisoners who are eligible to vote, but are still incarcerated. That is misdemeanor, people who are incarcerated for misdemeanors, people who there are administrative reasons, as he lined out. We've been working with sheriffs in various counties where most of these prisoners would be held to make sure they have the right to vote and their knowledge of the ability to vote is there, especially as the deadlines approach. That's something I very strongly support. So we are working on that. It is important. We do not and never have had a post-incarceration restriction on felons. So we're different than many of the other states where that has been such a high-profile issue. And certainly we reach out to every voter, as I mentioned earlier, some of the instances that we've had to deal with. So it's surely something we support, and my office is administratively supported, working with Sheriff, for instance, Sheriff Katusian in Middlesex, our largest county, has had an active program working on this issue, which we support.
Thank you so much. Dean Nobles, why is infrastructure important, or issues like infrastructure important to the democratic process? How can we improve those issues within Black and Brown communities, so that cities such as Jackson, Mississippi, and others aren't left without water for weeks as they are now after being hit by a winter storm?
Sure. No, that's a really important question. Public facilities and infrastructures are often overlooked when we think about quality of life issues and also kind of taken for granted. And oftentimes it's difficult, and I'm not an expert here on kind of state budgetary issues, but we all know that it's hard to get it a priority on budgets, and budgets are, as many politicians often say, a way, not only statements of priorities, but also moral documents in certain kinds of ways. But I think what the Black Lives Matter movement is showing is that the notions of equity have to extend to things that are on their face kind of racially neutral in some kind of way, that that seemingly wouldn't have a racial dimension. And certain of these may be just administration of public facilities and their upkeep. But I also want to say it also ties pretty closely with the creation of majority Black cities in the South, in particular. And so you mentioned Jackson, Mississippi is not the only place. There's several other cities in the South, which is itself a direct result of desegregation and the hollowing out of cities, with whites moving out, sending their kids to desegregation academies, private schools, and Black cities ringed by white suburbs, where the infrastructure, where county lines and tax dollars and the rest are it's distributed in such a way that suburbs get more than cities. So it's partly an issue that is about kind of public expenditures, but must be told within the history of desegregation of the South in particular, and for that matter, other parts of the country, when Blacks moved to different cities and such. So it is, in the end, a racial story, or at least the story of American demographic movements and where people live, and then in turn, where tax dollars are sent, and arguably the loss of money in cities through a lot of complex budgetary things. I'm not an expert on that, but there's been a ton written about what Black mayors became mayors and then cities had no money, right? So there's a lot that's written about that in political science, and so so this is a part of the larger stories. I think the Black Lives Matter movement now, our rethinking again in the 21st century, makes us think about the unfinished business of civil rights.
Dean Nobles, that's a whole nother discussion. Wow. And I just think that, again, all of you have offered such a diverse set of perspectives. You're all engaged in critical work. As we close this out, I really hope this is not the last time that we have the opportunity to hear from you. It's shameful that it's only limited to an hour today, but I want to thank you for being so gracious and so transparent. And if there is, of course, anything we can do to support your efforts, please reach out to the sponsoring organizations. I'm going to turn this over now to Matt Victor of the Good Governance Project, and thank our audience for sticking with us. A lot of us have actually have a class coming up as we speak. So thank you all again.
Yes, thank you everyone for joining us. Thank you to our panelists and our moderator, Jordan, flawlessly done. This event was put on by the Black Law Student Association and the Good Governance Project associated with the Clow Center. thank you all for tuning in, and we will have more events as the semester goes on. So thank you and have a great afternoon.
Thank you.